They called it adoption. A simple transaction. A better life for unwanted children. That's what the paperwork said. What the judges signed. What the wealthy families paid for. But paperwork lies. Ask Monique Jackson, the single mother who died, fighting to protect her children from men who came in the night. Ask her 8-year-old son Isaiah, who spent 3 years being told to forget his real name, his mother's love, his sister's existence. Ask little Lila, kept in a basement room with barred windows, told her brother was dead and her mother had sold them both. But they made one crucial mistake. They crossed paths with Officer Ethan Brooks, a cop carrying his own weight of failure, who saw past a perfect blonde smile and manicured nails to recognize the predator beneath. A man who, for the first time in his 20-year career, looked at a terrified child running through a darkening park and chose to truly listen. Now a trafficking empire is about to learn why you should never underestimate a mother's love, a child's memory, or a broken man's shot at redemption. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in a hail of bullets or a kick-down-the-door raid. Sometimes it comes in a child's whispered truth. She's not my real mom. And truth, like vengeance, is patient. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Park as Officer Ethan Brooks sat in his patrol car, lost in thought. His weathered hands rested on the steering wheel, and his blue eyes scanned the quiet playground more out of habit than necessity. The park was nearly empty now, with just a few parents gathering their children as dinner time approached. A familiar ache settled in his chest as he watched a father push his young son on the swings. The boy's laughter carried across the park, reminding Ethan of similar moments with his own son Tyler before everything fell apart. 3 years had passed since Tyler last answered his calls or responded to his messages. The divorce had been hard on everyone, but losing his relationship with Tyler cut deeper than anything else. Some protector I turned out to be, Ethan muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. At 45, he'd learned that some wounds time couldn't heal. The guilt of not being there enough for Tyler gnawed at him daily, especially during quiet moments like this. He'd thrown himself into his work after the divorce, taking extra shifts and volunteering for holiday duty, anything to keep his mind off the empty house and unanswered messages. The sound of running footsteps jolted Ethan from his thoughts. Through his rearview mirror, he spotted a small figure racing toward his patrol car. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, tears streaming down his dark face as he ran. His right arm was clutched close to his chest, and pure terror filled his eyes. Ethan immediately stepped out of his car, his instincts kicking in as the boy reached him. The child's breaths came in ragged gasps, and his whole body trembled with fear. His t-shirt was torn at the sleeve, and there were grass stains on his jeans as if he'd fallen while running. "She's not my real mom," the boy cried out, his voice breaking with fear. "Please, please help me, don't let her take me back there." Before Ethan could respond, a white woman in her late 30s came hurrying across the park. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her designer clothes seemed out of place for an afternoon at the playground. Something about her polished appearance felt wrong for someone who'd just been chasing after a child. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached, each step precise and measured despite her apparent hurry. "Isaiah, stop this nonsense right now," the woman called out, her voice carrying a sharp edge despite her attempt at a pleasant tone. "Officer, I'm so sorry about this. He's been acting out lately. You know how children can be at this age." Ethan noticed how Isaiah flinched at the sound of her voice, instinctively moving to stand behind him. The boy's small hands gripped the back of Ethan's uniform shirt, trembling. His breathing quickened, and Ethan could feel the child's rapid heartbeat through the thin fabric of his shirt. "Ma'am, please stay where you are for a moment," Ethan said, holding up his hand. He turned slightly, keeping both the woman and Isaiah in his sight. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" The woman's perfectly manicured hands smoothed down her blouse, a practiced smile spreading across her face. "I'm Heather Williams. Isaiah is my adopted son. He's been having some behavioral issues lately, making up stories for attention. We're working with a therapist on his attachment problems." Something in her tone set off warning bells in Ethan's mind. He'd interviewed enough people over his 20-year career to recognize when someone was trying too hard to appear calm. The way her eyes darted between him and Isaiah, the slight tremor in her perfectly modulated voice, it all spoke of something deeper than a simple family dispute. "Isaiah," Ethan said softly, crouching down to the boy's level while maintaining awareness of Heather's position. "Can you tell me what happened?" "Take your time, buddy. You're safe here." Isaiah's dark eyes darted between Ethan and Heather, fear evident in every movement. A tear rolled down his cheek as he gathered the courage to speak. "She took me from my real mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My mom's name is Monique. She works at the hospital. She helps sick people. I have a little sister too, Lila. She's only 6. His voice cracked on his sister's name. "Please, you have to believe me. They hurt my mom when she tried to stop them." Heather's laugh cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. "Isaiah, sweetheart, we've been through this. I adopted you legally. You're just confused about your birth mother, and that's okay. But you need to stop telling these stories. It's not fair to me or to the other families who've tried to help you." Ethan noticed how Heather's fingers twitched as she spoke, her carefully constructed facade showing cracks. She took a step forward, and Isaiah pressed himself harder against Ethan's back, whimpering softly. The boy's reaction wasn't just fear. It was pure terror. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to need to separate you two for a moment while we sort this out," Ethan said, his voice firm but professional. He reached for his radio, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brooks. I need CPS to meet me at Jefferson Park regarding a possible domestic situation." Heather's practiced smile faltered, a flash of something dark crossing her face before she composed herself. "This is ridiculous. I have all the adoption paperwork at home. Isaiah is just upset because I grounded him for breaking a vase. He's making up stories to get back at me. You're wasting everyone's time here." But Ethan had already noticed the marks on Isaiah's arm, marks that looked suspiciously like finger bruises. As he gently rolled up the boy's sleeve, with Isaiah's permission, he discovered more concerning signs. Old scars that had no place on a child's body. Some looked like burns, others like cuts that had healed poorly. "My mom never hurt me," Isaiah said suddenly, his voice stronger despite his tears. "She used to sing to me and Lila every night, gospel songs about Jesus. She made the best mac and cheese, and she always said grace before dinner. On Sundays we'd go to church, and then she'd take us to the park just like this one." The specific details poured out of him, like he'd been holding them in for too long. "She worked the night shift at the hospital, but she always tucked us in first. She smelled like vanilla, and her hands were always soft." The specific details caught Ethan's attention. Children telling lies rarely included such precise memories, such sensory details. He watched as Heather's composure cracked further, her fingers now curling into fists at her sides. Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder, and she grabbed it with unnecessary force. "I demand you return my son to me right now," Heather said, her voice losing its sugary coating. "You have no right to keep him from me. I'll have your badge for this. Do you know who I am in this community? Who my friends are?" Ethan stood slowly, positioning himself between Isaiah and Heather. His years of experience told him this was more than a simple case of a child acting out. "Ma'am, until we can verify your claims and ensure Isaiah's safety, he'll need to come with me to the station. CPS will meet us there to review the situation." "You can't do this." Heather's voice rose, drawing attention from the few remaining park goers. A young mother hurried her children toward the parking lot, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I have rights. I'll call my lawyer. You have no idea what you're getting into, Officer Brooks." "Please do," Ethan replied calmly, noticing how Isaiah relaxed slightly at the growing distance between himself and Heather. "We'll need to see all documentation regarding Isaiah's adoption anyway. The more information we have, the faster we can resolve this." As if on cue, a CPS vehicle pulled into the park's parking lot. Heather's face darkened as she saw the car approach, her mask of concern completely falling away. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "Both of you will regret this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." While Heather made her calls, pacing back and forth in her expensive heels, Ethan knelt beside Isaiah again. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Can you tell me more about your sister? Anything you remember might help us find her." Isaiah's eyes welled with fresh tears, but his voice was steadier now. "Lila's really smart. She was just learning to read when—" He swallowed hard. "She was crying when they took her somewhere else. I promised Mom I'd protect her, but I couldn't." His small shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. "They hurt Mom. When she tried to stop them, there were these men. They came at night." The boy's voice trailed off, his eyes taking on a distant look that Ethan had seen too many times in trauma victims. "She fought so hard," Isaiah whispered. "Mom kept screaming for us to run, but they caught us anyway. They put us in different cars. Lila was crying for me." Ethan felt his heart constrict. In 20 years of police work, he'd seen plenty of ugly situations, but something about this felt different. The specificity of Isaiah's memories, the way Heather's demeanor had shifted, the physical evidence on Isaiah's body. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a child acting out. The CPS worker, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, approached them carefully. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the pavement, and her gentle demeanor provided a stark contrast to Heather's aggressive energy. "Hi there," she said warmly to Isaiah. "Would you like to come with me? We can talk somewhere quiet and maybe get you something to eat?" Isaiah looked up at Ethan, fear flickering across his face again. His hand reached out, catching the edge of Ethan's uniform. "Will you come too? Please don't leave me alone." "I'll be right there," Ethan assured him, watching as Sandra gently led Isaiah toward her car. The boy kept glancing back, as if afraid Ethan would disappear if he looked away too long. The setting sun cast long shadows across the playground, making everything seem slightly surreal. Ethan turned his attention back to Heather, who was now speaking rapidly into her phone, her back turned to him. The evening breeze carried fragments of her conversation. "I don't care what it takes," she was saying, her voice low and urgent. "Fix this now. Use whatever connections you have to shut it down. No, you don't understand. This could expose everything. Everything. Just make it go away." Ethan cleared his throat, causing Heather to whirl around. Her face was flushed with anger, and her perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I'll need you to come to the station as well. We'll need to see those adoption papers you mentioned." Heather's eyes narrowed as she ended her call. "You've made a serious mistake, Officer Brooks. I have friends in high places. This will not end well for you. By tomorrow morning, you'll be lucky if you're still wearing that badge." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the ice in her words. "But right now, my only concern is that boy's safety. If everything checks out, you have nothing to worry about." As he watched Heather storm off toward her luxury SUV, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stumbled onto something much bigger than a domestic dispute. Isaiah's words about his sister and mother kept replaying in his mind, along with Heather's threatening phone call. Something ugly was hiding behind her polished facade, and he intended to find out what it was. Walking back to his patrol car, Ethan glanced at the park playground, now empty in the fading daylight. The swings moved gently in the evening breeze, creaking softly like wounded things. Paper trash skittered across the ground, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The peaceful scene from earlier seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. He thought of Tyler again, of all the ways he'd failed as a father. The memory of his son's disappointed face haunted him daily, but this time, it steeled his resolve rather than weakening it. Maybe he couldn't fix his past mistakes, but he could make sure this boy didn't slip through the cracks. "Not this time," he murmured, starting his car. "Not this kid." The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Ethan spread out the so-called adoption papers across his desk. Something wasn't adding up. The documents Heather had provided were filled with inconsistencies, missing signatures, unclear dates, and sections that appeared to have been altered. Each discrepancy made his suspicions grow stronger. Sandra, the CPS worker, sat across from him, her brow furrowed, as she examined another stack of papers. "These aren't standard adoption forms," she said, tapping a page with her pen. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen documentation like this." Isaiah had fallen asleep on the break room couch down the hall, exhausted from hours of gentle questioning. The boy's earlier terror had given way to bone-deep weariness, but not before he'd shared more details about his mother and sister. Each memory he'd recalled had been vivid and consistent. The red-shuttered house where he'd last seen Lila, the smell of his mother's vanilla lotion, the sound of her voice singing hymns at bedtime. "There's something else," Ethan said, pulling up his computer database. "I ran a search for missing persons reports from the last few years. Look at this." He turned the screen towards Sandra, revealing a 3-year-old report that made his chest tight with anger. The photo showed a beautiful, black woman in nurse's scrubs, her smile bright and genuine. Beside her stood 2 children, Isaiah, younger but unmistakable, and a small girl with beaded braids who could only be Lila. The report had been filed by Monique Jackson's co-workers at Memorial Hospital when she failed to show up for 3 consecutive shifts. "She was a pediatric nurse," Ethan read aloud, his voice rough with emotion. "Single mother, 2 kids. No history of disappearing, no custody disputes, no red flags. She just vanished one night along with both children. The case went cold within months." Sandra leaned forward, her eyes scanning the report. "The timing matches Isaiah's story. And look at this. There were signs of forced entry at their apartment, but the investigating officers ruled it as inconclusive evidence of foul play. How is that possible?" Ethan's jaw clenched. Someone wanted this case buried. He thought of Heather's phone call in the park, her threats about connections in high places. The question is, how deep does this go? A soft knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Officer Sarah Martinez, a rookie Ethan had been mentoring, stood in the doorway with a troubled expression. "You need to see this, Brooks. I did some digging on that adoption agency Heather Williams listed. They've had 6 complaints filed against them in the past 2 years, all sealed by court order." "Sealed by whom?" Ethan asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "Judge Thomas Bradford." Sarah handed him a file. "The same judge who supposedly signed off on Isaiah's adoption papers." The pieces were starting to form a pattern, and it made Ethan's blood run cold. He turned back to his computer, pulling up Bradford's record. The judge had presided over dozens of adoptions, in recent years, all handled by the same small agency. Too many coincidences for comfort. "Sandra, what do you know about this agency?" he asked, noting how the CPS worker's expression darkened at the name. "New Beginnings Family Services?" "They're relatively new, maybe 5 years old. They handle a lot of private adoptions, mostly for wealthy clients." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There have been rumors. Nothing concrete enough to investigate, but stories about children being placed too quickly, paperwork being rushed through." A noise from the doorway made them all turn. Isaiah stood there in his wrinkled clothes, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His small face was etched with worry lines no child should have. "Mr. Ethan?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I remembered something else. About the house where they took Lila." Ethan immediately softened his expression, gesturing for Isaiah to come closer. "What do you remember, buddy?" The red shutters were peeling, and there was a big tree in the front yard, one of those ones with the branches that hang down like curtains. Isaiah's forehead creased with concentration. "And I saw a sign when we drove there, something about a creek or a river." Sarah was already at her computer. "There's a Willow Creek area about 40 minutes outside the city. Lots of older homes out there." "The tree you saw might have been a weeping willow," Ethan explained gently to Isaiah. "That would match the area. Can you remember anything else about the drive there?" Isaiah closed his eyes, his small hands gripping the edge of Ethan's desk. "We passed a big blue water tower, and there was a store with a giant ice cream cone on top." His voice caught. "Lila was crying about wanting ice cream, but they wouldn't." "Stop." Ethan shared a look with Sarah, who was already mapping the route. "Davidson's Dairy," she said, It's right off the highway near Willow Creek, and there's only one water tower along that stretch. Sandra had been quietly taking notes, but now she spoke up. Isaiah, sweetheart, you're being so brave. Would you like to get something to eat? The vending machine has those cheese crackers you liked earlier. Isaiah looked uncertainly at Ethan, who gave him an encouraging nod. Go ahead, buddy. I'll be right here when you get back. Once Isaiah had left with Sandra, Ethan turned to Sarah. I want satellite images of every house with red shutters in the Willow Creek area, and check property records, see if any of race. Them connect back to our judge or that adoption agency. What about Heather? Sarah asked, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She left the station hours ago, but she made some calls first. Should we be watching her? Ethan considered this. Heather's threat suggested she had powerful allies, people who could make evidence disappear and silence investigations. They needed to move carefully. Put a discreet tail on her, but make it someone she doesn't know. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. And Sarah? Keep this quiet. If Isaiah's right, we're dealing with something bigger than just one kidnapped family. The next few hours passed in a blur of database searches and phone calls. Every new piece of information added to the disturbing picture forming in Ethan's mind. The adoption agency had handled dozens of cases in recent years, all following a similar pattern. Single parents, often minorities, disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Their children would surface months later, adopted by wealthy families through suspiciously expedited processes. Around midnight, Sarah burst into the office, her face flushed with excitement. Got it! A property on Willow Creek Road, bought 3 years ago by a shell company. Guess who one of the company directors is? She slapped a document onto Ethan's desk. There, listed among the corporate officers, was a familiar name. Bradford, Thomas J. The house matches Isaiah's description exactly, Sarah continued, pulling up satellite images. Red shutters, weeping willow in the front yard. And look at this. She zoomed in on recent photos showing expensive cars coming and going at odd hours. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. They had a lead, a real, tangible lead that could help them find Lila. But he also knew they had to move carefully. If they spooked the wrong people, evidence could vanish, and Lila might disappear deeper into whatever network they were uncovering. Isaiah had fallen asleep again, this time in Ethan's office chair. Looking at the boy's peaceful face, Ethan felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. He thought of his own son, Tyler, and all the times he'd failed to be there for him. He wouldn't fail Isaiah, not this time. We need to do this by the book, he told Sarah quietly. Everything documented, everything backed up. These people have connections, but they're not untouchable. No one is. Sarah nodded, her young face set with determination. I'll start putting together the surveillance warrant request, but Brooks... She hesitated. Someone tried to access Isaiah's file in the system about an hour ago, used a judge's credentials. Bradford? No, different judge. The request was flagged because it came from an unauthorized terminal. She met his eyes. They're already moving to cover their tracks. Ethan's phone buzzed, a text from Sandra. She'd taken Isaiah to a secure foster placement for the night, somewhere safe and off the books. The boy had gone reluctantly, making Ethan promise to come see him first thing in the morning. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah spoke up. He'll be okay, Brooks. Sandra's the best at what she does. I know. Ethan stared at the satellite image of the house with the red shutters, thinking of another little girl who might be trapped inside. But Lila's still out there. And after what Isaiah told us about that night, he couldn't finish the sentence. Isaiah had described men coming in the darkness, his mother fighting desperately to protect her children. The boy's voice had shaken as he recalled how they'd hit Monique, how she'd kept screaming for her children even as they dragged her away. The missing persons report listed no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. Someone had sanitized the scene, erased the truth of what happened that night. How many other families had suffered the same fate? Sarah interrupted his dark thoughts. I cross-referenced the names from other adoptions Bradford approved. 3 more cases with similar patterns. Single parents disappearing, children adopted through new beginnings within months. All the investigative files were sealed. How many children total? At least 12 that we can confirm. Sarah's voice was tight with anger. Maybe more. The agency's records are incomplete, and some of the files look like they've been altered. Ethan thought of Isaiah's scars, the fear in his eyes when Heather approached. How many other children bore similar marks? How many had been torn from their families and placed with people who saw them as possessions, rather than human beings? His computer pinged, an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line made his heart skip. Monique Jackson, case file 2847. Brooks? Sarah noticed his expression. What is it? He opened the email carefully, aware that it could be a trap. Inside was a single sentence. Check the morgue records from 6 months ago. Jane Doe, 847. The sender's address was already disabled when he tried to reply. Someone on the inside was reaching out. Someone who knew the truth about what happened, to Isaiah's mother. Sarah, I need you to do one more thing tonight. He scribbled the case number on a sticky note. Call the county morgue. There's a Jane Doe we need to look into. She took the note, her face grim. You think it's her? Isaiah's mom? I think someone wants us to find out. Ethan looked at the sleeping boy, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they might discover. But that's tomorrow's battle. Right, now we need to focus on building a case that no one can bury. The night stretched on, filled with the quiet sounds of investigation, keyboard clicks, shuffling papers, murmured phone calls. Somewhere in the city, Heather Williams was probably making her own calls, trying to use her connections to make this all go away. But Ethan had seen too much, heard too much to let that happen. He thought of Isaiah's description of the night everything changed. The sound of breaking glass, his mother's desperate prayers, Lila's terrified cries. Someone had orchestrated that nightmare, believing their money and influence would protect them from consequences. Looking at the growing pile of evidence on his desk, Ethan made a silent vow. They would find Lila. They would uncover the truth about Monique. And everyone involved in this twisted operation would face justice, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The first light of dawn was starting to creep through his office windows. Another day was beginning, bringing them one step closer to the truth. Ethan knew the real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Isaiah had run to him in the park, he felt something like hope. They had names now. They had places to look. Most importantly, they had Isaiah's trust and his memories. Pure, unvarnished truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. Sometimes, Ethan reflected, that's all you need to start unraveling, even the most carefully constructed lies. Sarah returned from her last phone call of the night, her face pale but determined. The morgue records are sealed too, she said quietly. But I got a supervisor who remembers the case. The body was found, near Willow Creek. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that information settle. Another piece of the puzzle, another thread connecting this web of corruption. When he opened them again, his resolve was stronger than ever. First light, he said. We start building the case. Every detail documented, every connection mapped. These people think money and power make them untouchable. Let's prove them wrong. The morning sun painted his office in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in the city, a little boy was waiting for him to keep his word. And somewhere, in a house with red shutters, a little girl was waiting to be found. The night terrors always started the same way. Isaiah would see his mother's face, illuminated by the harsh glare of streetlights, her eyes wide with fear as she pushed him and Lila toward the back door. Run, babies, she'd whisper urgently. Don't look back. Just run. But in the dreams, unlike reality, Isaiah could never move fast enough. His feet felt like they were stuck in mud as he watched the shadowy figures grab his mother, her screams echoing in the darkness. He woke with a start, his small body trembling beneath unfamiliar blankets. The foster home Sandra had brought him to was quiet and dark, but Isaiah couldn't shake the lingering terror of his nightmare. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he hugged his knees to his chest. trying to make himself as small as possible. "Mom?" he whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." A soft knock at the door made him jump. Mrs. Reynolds, the foster mother, peeked in with concern etched on her kind face. "Isaiah? I heard you crying, sweetheart. Would you like some hot chocolate?" Isaiah hesitated, then nodded slowly. Mrs. Reynolds reminded him a little of his mother, not in looks, but in the gentle way she moved and spoke. She hadn't tried to hug him or force him to talk since he arrived, and that made him feel safer somehow. In the kitchen, the warm light cast soft shadows as Mrs. Reynolds prepared 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She added extra marshmallows to Isaiah's cup without asking, just like his mom used to do. The simple gesture made his throat tight with emotion. "Mr. Ethan will be here in the morning," Mrs. Reynolds said softly, sliding the mug toward him. "He called earlier to check on you." Isaiah wrapped his hands around the warm mug, remembering how safe he'd felt when Officer Brooks had protected him from Heather in the park. It seemed like days ago, though it had been less than 24 hours. "I keep seeing it," Isaiah whispered, staring into his hot chocolate. "The night they took us, Mom was making dinner. Mac and cheese with the crispy breadcrumbs on top. Lila was doing her homework at the kitchen table. Everything was normal, and then Mrs. Reynolds sat quietly, letting him take his time with the memory. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background, marking the peaceful silence. There was a noise at the front door. Mom looked scared right away, like she knew something bad was coming. She told us to go out the back way to run to Mrs. Thompson's house next door. Isaiah's voice shook. But they were already in the backyard too, these men in dark clothes. Mom tried to fight them when they grabbed Lila. She knocked one of them down, but there were too many. The hot chocolate sat untouched, growing cold as Isaiah's memories spilled out. They hit her. She fell, but she kept trying to get up. Kept calling our names. Lila was screaming for her, but they put her in one car and me in another. I promised Mom I'd protect Lila, but I couldn't even stay with her. "Oh, sweetheart." Mrs. Reynolds' voice was thick with emotion. "None of that was your fault. You were just a little boy against grown men." "But I promised," Isaiah insisted, tears falling faster now. "And then they took me to that first house where everything was cold and dark. Different people kept coming to look at me, like I was something in a store. Then Heather came, and she picked me like you'd pick a puppy." His small hands clenched into fists. "She said I should be grateful, that she was giving me a better life than my real mom could. But Mom gave us the best life. We didn't have fancy things, but we had love. We said prayers together every night, and she never hit us or locked us in the basement when we cried." The implications of that last statement hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Reynolds fought to keep her face neutral, though her heart ached for the trauma this child had endured. "Isaiah," she said gently, "you're safe now. No one here will hurt you like that. And Officer Brooks, Mr. Ethan, he's going to find Lila. He promised, remember?" Isaiah nodded, finally taking a small sip of his now lukewarm chocolate. "He reminds me of how Mom was with her patients at the hospital. She always said that helping people who can't help themselves is the most important job in the world." The memory brought a ghost of a smile to his face. "She worked in the children's wing. Sometimes she'd let me and Lila come visit after school, and we'd help her make the sick kids laugh. She knew all these funny songs, and she'd teach them to us." His voice grew stronger as he recalled happier times. "On Sundays, she'd wake us up early for church. Lila always complained about the scratchy tights she had to wear, but Mom said we had to look our best for Jesus. After church, we'd go to the park or the library. Mom said feeding our minds was just as important as feeding our bodies." Mrs. Reynolds listened, understanding that Isaiah needed to hold on to these memories, to remind himself that his life hadn't always been filled with darkness. "She sounds like an amazing mother," she said softly. "She was the best." Isaiah's lower lip trembled. Do you think she's okay? The bad men hurt her really bad that night." Before Mrs. Reynolds could respond, another memory seemed to hit Isaiah. "The red house," he exclaimed. "I just remembered something else about where they took Lila. There was a broken windmill in the yard, and you could hear trains at night. Lila was scared of the train sounds at first. Mrs. Reynolds immediately reached for her phone. I'm going to text Officer Brooks about that right now. Every detail helps, sweetheart. Isaiah watched her send the message, his young face set with determination despite his exhaustion. Mr. Ethan said Lila might be scared and confused when we find her, but I remember all her favorite songs and stories. I can help her remember who she really is. The clock showed it was nearly 3 in the morning, but Isaiah seemed more awake now, energized by his sense of purpose. Mom used to say that memories are like treasure. Nobody can steal them if you keep them safe in your heart. That's why Heather could never make me forget, no matter how much she tried. His voice dropped to a whisper. She used to get so mad when I talked about Mom or Lila. She said they weren't my real family anymore, that I needed to forget them and be grateful for my new life. But how can you forget part of your heart? Mrs. Reynolds fought back her own, tears at the quiet wisdom in his words. You can't, sweetheart, and you shouldn't have to. Sometimes, Isaiah continued, gaining confidence in the safety of the quiet kitchen. When Heather would lock me in the basement, I'd sing the songs Mom taught us. It helped me remember who I really was, even in the dark. Lila's favorite was This Little Light of Mine. Mom said it was about keeping hope alive no matter what. He hummed a few bars of the familiar hymn, his sweet voice carrying the melody that had comforted him through countless dark nights. Do you think Lila still remembers the songs? I'm sure she does, Mrs. Reynolds assured him. Love like that doesn't just disappear. Isaiah nodded, his eyelids finally starting to grow heavy again. Mom always said that too. She said love is stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than anything bad in the world. His voice caught on a yawn. I tried to be strong like her, even when I was scared. Mrs. Reynolds gently guided him back to his room, making sure his nightlight was on and the door stayed slightly open. As she tucked him in, Isaiah grabbed her hand. Will you tell Mr. Ethan something when he comes? His dark eyes were serious in the dim light. Tell him I remembered about the trains, and tell him thank you for believing me. Nobody else ever did. After Isaiah finally drifted off to sleep, Mrs. Reynolds sat in her living room, sending a detailed text to Officer Brooks about everything Isaiah had shared. The boy's memories weren't just trauma surfacing. They were vital clues that could help find his sister and uncover the truth about what happened to his mother. Satin. Sun was just beginning to paint the sky with hints of dawn when Ethan arrived. Isaiah was still sleeping, but Mrs. Reynolds met him on the porch to share everything she'd learned during the night. The trains, Ethan muttered, making notes. That narrows it down. There's only one rail line near Willow Creek. He looked up at Mrs. Reynolds, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. How is he? Stronger than any child should have to be, she replied softly. But healing. He trusts you, Officer Brooks. That's no small thing given what he's been through. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. We're close to finding Lila. I can feel it. And maybe... He hesitated. Maybe we can finally give him answers about his mother, too. Inside, Isaiah stirred in his sleep. But this time, his dreams were different. He saw his mother's face bathed in sunlight instead of shadows, heard her laugh instead of her screams. In his dream, she held him and Lila close, singing their favorite hymn as she swayed gently back and forth. This little light of mine, she sang softly. I'm gonna let it shine. Even in sleep, Isaiah smiled, holding tight to the memory of her voice. No one could take that away from him, not Heather, not the men in dark clothes, not all the fear and pain of the past 3 years. His mother's love was a light that kept burning, guiding him through the darkness toward hope. When he woke later that morning, the sun was streaming through his window, and he could smell breakfast cooking downstairs. For the first time in years, he didn't immediately feel afraid. Instead, he felt something that had been missing since that terrible night. Purpose. He had told Mr. Ethan everything he could remember about the red house, about the trains, about the broken windmill that creaked in the wind. Every memory, was another piece of the puzzle, another step closer to finding Lila. And maybe, just maybe, finding out what happened to their mother too. Isaiah touched the small cross necklace he wore, the only thing he'd managed to keep when they took him from home. It had been his mother's, pressed into his hand during those final chaotic moments. The metal was warm against his skin, like a constant reminder of her love. "I won't give up, Mom," he whispered to the morning light. "I promise." Downstairs, he could hear Mr. Ethan's voice talking with Mrs. Reynolds. He sounded tired but determined, just like Mom used to sound after a long night shift at the hospital. The thought gave Isaiah courage. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone was, finally fighting for him, for Lila, for the truth. And the truth, his mother always said, was like the sun. It might hide behind clouds for a while, but it always finds its way out eventually. Isaiah held on to that belief as he got ready to face another day, another step closer to making their broken family whole again. Dawn painted the sky in shades of steel gray as Ethan's unmarked police car crept along Willow Creek Road. The steady rumble of an approaching freight train vibrated through the morning air, the same sound Isaiah had remembered hearing during his nights of captivity. In the passenger seat, Sarah studied satellite images on her tablet, methodically comparing them to each property they passed. The tension in the vehicle was palpable as they searched for the house that matched Isaiah's memories. "There," Sarah whispered, suddenly touching Ethan's arm. She pointed to a weathered Victorian home set back from the road, partially hidden behind overgrown shrubbery. Red shutters, peeling with age, hung askew from grimy windows, their faded paint matching Isaiah's description perfectly. A broken windmill stood sentinel in the unkempt front yard, its rusty blades creaking with each gust of wind. And there, dominating the landscape, stood a massive weeping willow, its branches creating the curtain-like effect Isaiah had described. Ethan pulled over 2 houses down, cutting the engine. They'd spent the last 12 hours building their case, gathering evidence, and securing warrants. 3 separate judges had reviewed their documentation, ensuring that no legal loophole could be exploited by the powerful people they were about to confront. Now, with a SWAT team staged nearby and backup units in position, they were ready to move. "All units, stand by," Ethan spoke quietly into his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Remember, our primary objective is the safety of the minor female, Lila Jackson. Age 9, black female, approximately 4 feet tall. Approach with extreme caution. Subject may be traumatized and frightened. No sudden movements or loud voices once we locate her." Sarah's fingernails dug into Ethan's arm. "Brooks, movement at the back door," she hissed, raising her binoculars. Through the pre-dawn gloom, they watched a woman hurry from the house toward a waiting car. She was carrying something. No, someone. A small figure wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket struggled weakly in her arms. The woman's expensive coat and heels seemed incongruous with the dilapidated property, much like Heather's polished appearance had been at the park. "All units, move in now." Ethan gunned the engine, gravel spraying as they accelerated toward the house. The SWAT team emerged from their positions like shadows coming to life, converging on the property from all sides. The sound of boots on grass and the metallic click of weapons being readied filled the air. The woman spotted them and made a desperate dash for her car, still clutching her struggling burden. But before she could reach the vehicle, 2 police cruisers blocked her escape route, their lights cutting through the morning darkness. She spun around, wild-eyed, and Ethan got his first clear look at what she was carrying. A little girl, frighteningly thin, with beaded braids just like in Monique's photo. Lila's dark eyes were wide with terror as she tried to make sense of the chaos erupting around her. "Put her down," Ethan's voice boomed through his vehicle's speaker. "Put her down and step away with your hands where we can see them." The woman, middle-aged, with perfectly styled gray hair and an expensive camel hair coat, looked frantically for an escape route. Finding none, she slowly lowered Lila to the ground, her manicured hands trembling. The moment her feet touched the asio, earth, Lila tried to run, but her legs gave out beneath her. Months or years of confinement had left her muscles weak. Ethan was out of his car and running before she hit the ground. He reached her just as Sarah took the woman into custody, the familiar sound of handcuffs clicking shut accompanied by the woman's protests about her lawyers and connections. "Lila," Ethan said softly, crouching down beside the trembling child. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, remembering how Isaiah had reacted to sudden gestures. "Lila, my name is Ethan. I'm a police officer, and I'm here to help you. Your brother Isaiah sent me to find you." The girl's head snapped up at her brother's name, disbelief warring with desperate hope in her eyes. "Isaiah." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as if she hadn't used it much lately. "You know my brother?" They told me he was dead." "He's very much alive, sweetheart. He's safe now, and he told me how to find you. He remembered everything, the red shutters, and the willow tree, and the sound of the trains at night. He never forgot you, not for a single day." Teresa spilled down Lila's hollow cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She looked severely malnourished, her clothes hanging loose on her small frame. But there was still a spark of her mother's strength in her eyes as she asked, "Can I see him, please?" "Very soon," Ethan promised, shrugging off his jacket to wrap around her shoulders. She was shivering, though whether from cold or shock he couldn't tell. "But first we need to have doctors check you out, make sure you're okay. Would that be all right?" Lila nodded, then suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm with surprising strength, her small fingers digging into his sleeve. "Don't let them separate us again. Please. They said Isaiah was dead. They said Mom gave us away because she didn't want us anymore. They said nobody was looking for me." Ethan's jaw clenched at the cruelty of their lies. "Nobody will ever separate you again, Lila. I give you my word. And everything they told you was a lie. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Isaiah never stopped looking for you, and now you're safe." The paramedics approached cautiously, their movements careful and measured. Ethan stayed right beside Lila as they checked her vital signs and began their initial assessment. Their faces grew increasingly grave as they documented signs of long-term neglect. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, poorly healed injuries, and what appeared to be ligature marks on her ankles. While the medical team worked, Sarah supervised the search of the house. What they found inside made Ethan's blood boil. A basement room with a small cot, barred windows, and a heavy lock on the outside of the door. Children's drawings covered one wall, some signed by Lila, others by names they didn't recognize. The air was damp and musty, heavy with the weight of suffering. "Brooks," Sarah's voice crackled through his radio, tight with controlled anger. "We found documents. This wasn't just about Isaiah and Lila. There are records of other children, dozens of them. Names, dates, locations, and prices." "Prices?" Ethan felt his stomach turn. They were selling them, taking kids from vulnerable families and selling them to wealthy couples who didn't want to wait for legal adoption processes. Papers rustled in the background. "And look who signed off on all the paperwork. Our friend Judge Bradford's signature is on everything, along with bank transfer records and notes about procurement costs and handling fees." "Get all of that to the DA immediately," Ethan ordered, watching as the paramedics prepared to transport Lila. "And Sarah? Check those names against missing persons reports. Let's find out how many families they've destroyed." In the ambulance, Lila hadn't let go of Ethan's hand. The paramedics worked around him, starting an IV to begin treating her dehydration. "Isaiah really sent you?" she asked again, as if afraid this was all a dream she might wake from. "He didn't forget me? He never stopped looking for you, Lila. Never stopped loving you. He remembered everything. The songs your mom used to sing, the prayers before dinner, even the way she smelled, like vanilla. He kept all those memories safe, just like your mom taught you to do." Fresh tears welled in Lila's eyes. Is Mom okay?" "They said she was gone, but they lie about everything. They're all liars." Ethan's heart clenched painfully in his chest. He couldn't lie to her. These children had been lied to enough. But he couldn't bring himself to tell her the full truth yet either, not when she was already so fragile. "We're still looking for her, sweetheart. Right now, let's focus on getting you better so you can see Isaiah. One step at a time, okay? At the hospital, A team of doctors and social workers was waiting. They whisked Lila away for a thorough examination, while Ethan stepped out to make a call that would change these children's lives forever. "Sandra, it's Brooks. We found her. Can you bring Isaiah to Children's Hospital?" He heard Sandra's relieved exclamation, followed by sounds of immediate movement. "But Sandra, prepare him. She's been through a lot. And we need to talk to both of them about their mother." The examination seemed to take forever, but finally, the doctors emerged with their preliminary report. Despite the severe neglect and psychological trauma, Lila would recover physically. She was malnourished and weak, with various minor injuries, but nothing that wouldn't heal with proper care. The emotional healing would take longer, but having her brother back would help immensely. When Isaiah arrived, his reunion with Lila shattered everyone's professional composure. The siblings clung to each other, sobbing and laughing at the same time, speaking in a rushed mixture of words and tears that only they could understand. Years of separation melted away as they held each other, their bond unbroken despite everything that had been done to tear them apart. "I knew you'd find me," Lila kept saying, her face buried in her brother's shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't forget me." "Never," Isaiah promised fiercely, his small arms wrapped protectively around his sister. "I remember everything, Lila. Everything Mom taught us. Everything she wanted us to know." Watching them, Ethan thought of the morgue records he'd reviewed that morning. The final piece of this tragedy that he would have to share with them. But not yet. Let them have this moment of pure joy first. Let them remember what it felt like to be whole again. Sarah appeared in the doorway, gesturing urgently for him to step outside. Her face was grim, her normally composed features tight with emotion. "The woman we arrested at the house. She's talking, trying to cut a deal." Sarah's voice shook with barely contained rage. "She confirmed everything. They targeted single parents, especially minorities, used their connections to bury investigations, paid off cops, judges, social workers, anyone who might ask questions. And Ethan. She told us about Monique." Ethan closed his eyes, though he'd already known what was coming. The Jane Doe in the morgue. DNA tests had confirmed it that morning. Monique Jackson had died fighting to protect her children, her body, dumped near Willow Creek like so much garbage. "She fought them," Sarah continued softly, her voice catching. "According to the woman, Monique injured 3 of their guys pretty badly. They didn't mean to kill her, but—" She trailed off, her fists clenched at her sides. "How do we tell those kids? How do we tell them their mother died trying to save them?" Through the hospital room window, Ethan could see Isaiah and Lila sharing a cup of pudding, their heads bent close together as they talked quietly. Despite everything they'd endured, they still had that unshakable sibling bond, that pure love their mother had instilled in them. "I'll tell them," he said quietly, his heart heavy with the responsibility. "They deserve to hear it from someone who cares about them. But not yet. Let them have this reunion first." The day passed in a blur of medical examinations, police interviews, and social worker consultations. Lila gradually shared more details about her captivity, the lonely nights, the constant threats, the lies they'd told her about her family. Each revelation strengthened the case against the trafficking ring and deepened Ethan's determination to see justice done. As evening approached, both children were exhausted, but refused to be separated even for a moment. The hospital staff had pushed 2 beds together so they could stay close, and Sandra had brought Isaiah's few belongings from the foster home, including the precious cross necklace that had been their mother's. "Mr. Ethan?" Isaiah called as Ethan turned to leave. "You kept your promise. You found Lila. Just like you helped me find her, buddy. Your memories led us right to her." Lila looked between them, then asked the question Ethan had been dreading. "Are you going to find Mom too?" Ethan sat down heavily in the chair between their beds. "Kids, there's something we need to talk about. It's about your mother, and it's going to be hard to hear. But you're together now, and you're safe, and that's what she wanted most in the world." As the sun set outside the hospital windows, Ethan gently shared the truth about their mother's fate. He told them how bravely she'd fought, how her last acts had been to protect them, how her love had given them the strength to survive and find each other again. The children's grief was raw and devastating, but they faced it together, clinging to each other, as they had clung to their memories through the dark years of separation. And as Ethan watched them comfort each other, he saw Monique's strength living on in both of them. "Mom used to say that love is stronger than death," Isaiah whispered to Lila as she cried. "Remember," she said, "as long as we remember her, she's still with us." Lila nodded, clutching the small cross necklace Isaiah had kept safe all these years. "Can we sing her favorite song, the one about the light?" Together, their voices shaky but determined, the siblings began to sing the hymn their mother had taught them. The simple melody carried through the quiet hospital room, a testament to the unbreakable bonds of family and the power of love to survive even the darkest nights. Ethan stood quietly by the door, his own eyes wet with tears. The case wasn't over. There were still arrests to make, conspirators to catch, other families to find. But here, in this moment, watching these brave children honor their mother's memory, he knew that justice was already beginning to be served. The truth had finally come to light, just as Monique had always promised it would. And though she couldn't be here to see it, her light lived on in the children she had loved so fiercely, children who, against all odds, had found their way back to each other. Morning sunlight streamed through the precinct windows as Ethan stared at the evidence wall, now covered with photos, documents, and connection maps. Red string linked faces to locations, creating a web of corruption that stretched across the city. At the center was Judge Bradford's photo, connected to dozens of illegal adoptions and suspicious bank transfers. Sarah burst into the office, clutching a fresh stack of papers. "We've got her, Brooks. Heather's talking." Her eyes blazed with triumph as she spread the documents across his desk. "She gave us everything: names, dates, locations, the whole operation." The investigation had exploded in the past 48 hours. What started with Isaiah's brave revelation in the park had uncovered a sophisticated trafficking ring targeting vulnerable families. Each new piece of evidence revealed more horrifying details of their operation. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to a spreadsheet. They had a system. Single parents, mostly minorities, working multiple jobs. They'd identified targets through hospital records, social services. Her voice caught. "That's how they found Monique. She was working night shifts at the children's ward." Ethan's jaw clenched as he studied the documents. They used her own job against her, watched her routine, learned when she'd be most vulnerable. The thought made his stomach turn. "What about the others?" "We've identified 37 families so far." Sarah's voice shook with barely contained rage. 22 children successfully placed with wealthy clients. The rest. She couldn't finish the sentence. "How many survived?" Ethan asked quietly. 19. Confirmed alive. 3 deceased. The others are still missing. Sarah sat heavily in a chair. Some of the buyers didn't know the truth. Others suspected but didn't want to ask questions. And then there were ones like Heather, fully aware and actively involved. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Martinez stood in the doorway, her expression grim. "DA's here, and you're going to want to see who they just brought in." They followed Martinez to the interview rooms. Through the one-way glass, Ethan saw Judge Bradford sitting alone at the table, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in custody. The man's arrogance had finally crumbled, replaced by the haunted look of someone who knew their world was collapsing. "He's ready to deal," the DA, Michael Chen, said without preamble. "But he wants guarantees, protection." "Protection?" Ethan's voice was dangerous and quiet. "Like the protection these children needed? Like the protection Monique Jackson needed?" Chen held up his hands. "I know. Trust me, I know. But his testimony could bring down the entire network. We're talking corrupt officials across 3 states, Brooks. Politicians, doctors, social workers. People who helped identify vulnerable targets and falsify documents." Ethan thought of Isaiah and Lila, now safely in temporary foster care with Mrs. Reynolds. They were starting to heal, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would take years to fade. And they were the lucky ones. They had survived. They had found each other again. "What's he offering?" Sarah asked, her notebook ready. Names of every client who knowingly purchased trafficked children. Evidence of bribes paid to officials. Bank records showing money laundering through legitimate adoption agencies. Chen's eyes were hard. And the location of the missing children. Ethan's head snapped up. All of them? He claims to know where each child was placed, says he kept records as insurance. Chen grimaced, though he presents it as wanting to ensure their welfare. The hypocrisy made Ethan's blood boil, but he forced himself to focus on the bigger picture. More children could be saved. More families could find closure. Sometimes justice meant dealing with devils. "Fine," he said finally, "but I want something else from him first. A recorded confession about Monique Jackson's case. Every detail. Those kids deserve to know exactly what happened to their mother." Chen nodded. "I'll make it happen. In the meantime, you should see this." He handed Ethan a flash drive. Security footage from a convenience store near the Jackson house, night of the abduction. Police lost it during the original investigation, but one of Bradford's associates held on to a copy. Insurance again. Back at his desk, Ethan plugged in the drive with trembling hands. The grainy footage showed a quiet street at night, then movement, 2 black SUVs pulling up to a small house, men in dark clothing emerging, moving with practiced efficiency. The timestamp matched the night Monique and her children disappeared. There, Sarah pointed at the screen. "Back door." They watched as 2 figures ran from the house, children, one carrying the other. Isaiah trying to protect Lila, just as he'd promised his mother. But they were quickly caught, separated, forced into different vehicles. Then Monique burst out of the house, wielding what looked like a baseball bat. She managed to strike 2 of the men before they subdued her. Even then, she kept fighting, kept trying to reach her children until a blow to the head finally stopped her. Ethan stopped the video, his hands shaking with rage. "Get this to the DA, and make copies, lots of them. This evidence doesn't disappear again." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of arrests and revelations. Bradford's testimony opened floodgates of information. Police raided homes across the city, rescuing more children, arresting more conspirators. The press descended like vultures, broadcasting details of the trafficking ring across national news. Through it all, Ethan kept his promise to Isaiah and Lila, visiting them daily at Mrs. Reynolds's home. He watched as they began to heal, their resilience astounding everyone who knew their story. They had started therapy, both individually and together, working through their trauma with the help of caring professionals. "Mr. Ethan," Isaiah said, one afternoon as they sat in Mrs. Reynolds's sunny backyard. "The news lady said they found more kids like us. Did they find their moms too?" Ethan chose his words carefully. "Some of them, buddy. We're still looking for others. But because of you, because you were brave enough to tell the truth, all these other families have a chance to be whole again." Lila, who had been quietly coloring nearby, looked up. "Mom would be proud, right? Because we helped stop the bad people?" "She would be so proud of both of you," Ethan assured them, his heart aching with love for these remarkable children. "She is proud of you." The courthouse was packed the day Heather Williams faced sentencing. Isaiah had asked to attend, to face the woman who had tried to steal his identity and erase his mother's memory. Ethan stood beside him in the gallery, ready to support him if the emotions became too much. Heather looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes replaced by prison orange, her carefully maintained facade crumbling as the charges were read. Trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, accessory to murder. The list went on and on. When the judge, a new one untainted by corruption, asked if anyone wished to speak, Isaiah stood. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he addressed the court. "My mom taught us that hate makes your heart sick," he said clearly. "So I don't hate you, Mrs. Williams. But I want you to know that you failed. You couldn't make me forget who I am. You couldn't make me forget my mom or my sister or where I came from, and now everyone knows the truth." The courtroom was silent as Isaiah returned to his seat. Ethan saw tears on more than a few faces, including some of the hardened court officers. Even Heather seemed shaken by the quiet dignity of the boy she had tried to break. The sentence, when it came, was severe: multiple life terms, no possibility of parole. Similar sentences had already been handed down to Bradford and other key conspirators. The trafficking ring was being dismantled piece by piece, its victims finally receiving justice. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments Ethan witnessed between Isaiah and Lila as they rebuilt their bond. It was in the way they kept their mother's memory alive through songs and stories. It was in their determination to help other children who had suffered similar fates. 1 month after Heather's sentencing, Ethan sat with the siblings at Monique's grave. They had helped choose the headstone, simple but beautiful, with her favorite Bible verse carved beneath her name. Isaiah and Lila had planted flowers, telling their mother about everything that had happened. "Mom always said the truth comes out in the end," Lila said softly, arranging fresh roses against the stone, like light shining in the darkness. "That's right," Isaiah agreed, his arm around his sister's shoulders. "And she said love is stronger than anything bad in the world." Ethan watched them lean against each other. These extraordinary children who had survived the unthinkable with their spirits intact. They were living proof of their mother's wisdom. Love had proven stronger than hatred, stronger than greed, stronger than all the forces that had tried to tear them apart. The investigation continued, reaching into other cities, uncovering more cases, saving more children. Each new rescue brought both heartbreak and hope: heartbreak for the trauma these families had endured, hope for the healing that could now begin. Sarah had taken charge of a special task force dedicated to finding the remaining missing children. Every day brought new leads, new possibilities. The evidence seized from Bradford and his conspirators had created a roadmap to help other victims find their way home. But for Ethan, the most important victory was right in front of him. Isaiah and Lila were thriving in Mrs. Reynolds' care, their bond growing stronger each day. They still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden movements or loud noises, but they were healing, supporting each other, keeping their mother's memory alive in everything they did. The media called it one of the biggest trafficking busts in state history. Documentaries were being made, books were being written, laws were being changed to prevent similar crimes. But none of that mattered as much as the sight of 2 children standing strong together, finally free to be who they truly were. "Mr. Ethan?" Isaiah's voice brought him back to the present. "Can we go see the other kids sometime? The ones like us? Maybe we can help them remember who they are too." Ethan smiled, his heart full of pride and love for these remarkable siblings. "I think that's a wonderful idea, buddy. Your mom would love that." As they left the cemetery, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Isaiah and Lila walked, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long behind them. They were carrying their mother's light forward, turning their pain into purpose, their trauma into triumph. The truth had finally come to light, just as Monique had promised it would. And though justice could never fully heal the wounds of the past, it had opened the door to a future filled with hope, not just for Isaiah and Lila, but for all the children who would be saved because of their courage. Love had proven stronger than darkness, just as Monique had taught her children. And in the end, that love had illuminated a path to justice, healing, and hope for countless others who had suffered in silence for too long. The investigation would continue. More children would be found. More perpetrators would face justice. But here, in this moment, watching Isaiah and Lila walk toward their future with heads held high, Ethan knew that the most important battle had already been won. The truth had come to light, and love had shown the way home. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Isaiah and Lila's new rooms in Ethan's house, casting warm patterns on freshly painted walls. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the park, and while the healing process was far from over, each day brought small victories and moments of joy that seemed impossible in the darker times. Lila stood in front of her mirror, carefully threading beads onto her braids just as her mother had once done. Her hands still trembled sometimes, but the familiar motions brought comfort. The bedroom around her was a testament to her growing security. Soft purple walls she had chosen herself, photographs of happy moments with Isaiah and Ethan, and a handmade quilt from Mrs. Reynolds covered her bed. Down the hall, Isaiah sat cross-legged on his own bed, surrounded by homework. His teachers had been amazed by his progress, noting how quickly he was catching up after years of neglect. But more impressive than his academic achievements was his emotional growth. The constant fear that had haunted his eyes was fading, replaced by a quiet confidence. Ethan watched from the doorway, his heart full as he observed Isaiah's concentration. The decision to adopt both children had come naturally, though the process had been complex. His own journey of healing, rebuilding his relationship with his son Tyler while creating a new family with Isaiah and Lila, had taught him that love could expand in ways he'd never imagined. "Need help with that math?" Ethan asked, knocking gently on the doorframe to announce his presence. He'd learned early on that sudden movements or sounds could trigger painful memories for both children. Isaiah looked up with a smile that still made Ethan's heart catch, so much like his mother's, according to the photos they'd found. "I think I've got it. Ms. Parker showed me a new way to solve these problems." "Good morning," Lila's voice chirped as she appeared behind Ethan, her newly beaded braids swaying. She'd grown stronger over the months, her formerly gaunt frame filling out with proper nutrition and care. The doctors were pleased with her physical recovery, though they noted she still had a way to go. "Morning, sunshine," Ethan replied, stepping aside to let her enter her brother's room. "Sleep okay?" A shadow crossed Lila's face. She'd had another nightmare then. They came less frequently now, but still haunted both children's dreams. "Isaiah helped," she said simply, settling beside her brother on the bed. "We sang Mom's songs until I felt better." The siblings shared a look of understanding that made Ethan's chest tight. Their bond had only grown stronger through their healing process, each supporting the other through tough moments. The therapist had remarked on their extraordinary resilience, attributing much of it to their unwavering connection and the strong foundation of love their mother had built. "Tyler's coming for dinner tonight," Ethan reminded them, watching their faces light up. The relationship between his biological son and adopted children had developed in beautiful, unexpected ways. Tyler, initially hesitant about his father's decision to adopt, had become a fierce protector and loving big brother to both Isaiah and Lila. "Can we make Mom's mac and cheese recipe?" Isaiah asked eagerly. They'd found Monique's recipe box at her old apartment, preserved by a kind neighbor who'd kept her things in storage. Each discovered recipe was like a small piece of their mother returned to them. "Of course," Ethan agreed. "And maybe Tyler can help you practice for your basketball tryouts after dinner?" The mention of basketball brought another smile to Isaiah's face. Sports had become a healthy outlet for him, a way to channel his emotions and build confidence. His therapist had strongly encouraged physical activities as part of his healing process. A knock at the front door interrupted their morning routine. Ethan noticed both children tense slightly, a reflexive response to unexpected sounds that he hoped would fade with time. "It's just Mrs. Reynolds," he assured them, having recognized her familiar pattern of knocks. "Remember she's bringing those photo albums?" The tension left their shoulders at the mention of their former foster mother. Mrs. Reynolds had remained a constant presence in their lives, offering additional support and sharing stories about their early days of freedom. She'd been the one to suggest creating memory books to help process their experiences. "Come in," Lila called out, her voice strong and clear, a far cry from the whisper she'd used in her first weeks of freedom. The therapy sessions were helping her reclaim her voice, literally and figuratively. Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, carrying several photo albums and a box of memorabilia. Her kind face broke into a warm smile at the sight of the children, doing normal everyday things, Isaiah with his homework, Lila with her freshly done hair. These ordinary moments were powerful symbols of their recovery. "Good morning, my loves," she greeted them, setting her burden down carefully. "Ready to work on these albums? I found some wonderful pictures from those first weeks." The children eagerly made space on Isaiah's bed for the albums. This project had been their therapist's idea, creating visual narratives of their healing journey to help process their experiences and celebrate their progress. Each photo told a story of recovery, of family rebuilt from ashes. "Look at this one," Mrs. Reynolds said softly, opening the first album. "This was the day after you two were reunited at the hospital." The photograph showed Isaiah and Lila asleep, in their pushed-together hospital beds, hands clasped even in sleep. Though both looked painfully thin and wore the shadows of their ordeals on their faces, there was a peace in their expression that spoke of the comfort they found in each other. "And here," she turned the page, "this was your first day at the park after everything happened." This image captured a moment of pure joy. Isaiah pushing Lila on a swing, both laughing despite their obvious physical weakness. Ethan remembered that day clearly. They'd been nervous about returning to a park, but Isaiah had insisted he wanted to replace the bad memories with good ones. "You were so brave," Ethan said quietly, watching them study the photographs. "Both of you. Still are." Lila traced the edge of a photograph showing her first day back at school. "I was scared," she admitted. "But Isaiah walked me to my classroom. Every day that first week. And Mr. Ethan waited in the parking lot every afternoon," Isaiah added, glancing up at his adoptive father with trust and affection that made Ethan's heart swell. More photos told the story of their journey. Their first Christmas together, Tyler's first visit, birthday celebrations that made up for years of missed ones. Each image captured a moment of healing, of family being rebuilt on a foundation of love and understanding. "Oh, here's one from the support group," Mrs. Reynolds noted, pointing to a picture of Isaiah and Lila with other recovered children. Siblings had started attending meetings with other young survivors, both receiving and offering support. Their experiences, though traumatic, had given them unique insights to help others healing from similar ordeals. "Remember what Mom used to say about helping others?" Isaiah asked Lila, who nodded immediately. "That helping people who can't help themselves is the most important job in the world," she recited. It was one of many of Monique's sayings that the children kept alive, weaving their mother's wisdom into their new life. The sound of another car pulling up outside made them all look up. Through the window they could see Tyler getting out of his vehicle, earlier than expected for dinner. He was carrying what looked like sports equipment, probably the new basketball he'd promised Isaiah. "Can we go say hi?" Lila asked, already, halfway to her feet. The fact that she asked instead of just running showed her growing understanding of boundaries and safety, another small victory in their recovery. "Of course," Ethan smiled, watching as both children hurried downstairs to greet their big brother. The sound of their excited voices and Tyler's warm laughter drifted up the stairs, a symphony of healing that filled the house with joy. Mrs. Reynolds stood beside Ethan, watching the reunion through the window. "They've come so far," she said, softly. "Monique would be so proud of them, of all of you." Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The past months had transformed all their lives in profound ways. His relationship with Tyler had healed as they worked together to support Isaiah and Lila. The children were recovering, growing stronger each day. Even his own wounds, the guilt over failing Tyler, the loneliness that had haunted him, were healing through the love of this unconventional family. Outside, Tyler was showing Isaiah how to dribble the new basketball while Lila offered enthusiastic commentary. The morning sun painted them in warm light, three siblings bonding despite not sharing blood. Love, Ethan had learned, had little to do with DNA and everything to do with choice, the daily choice to care, to support, to heal together. "Mr. Ethan," Isaiah's voice called from below. "Come play with us." "Yes, please," Lila added, her laugh carrying on the morning air. "Tyler says he can beat all of us together." Mrs. Reynolds gave him a gentle push toward the door. "Go on. These albums can wait. These moments right now, this is the real healing." As Ethan joined his children in the driveway, he marveled at how far they'd all come. Isaiah's natural athletic ability was beginning to shine through as he practiced dribbling. Lila's commentary had grown more confident, her voice carrying clearly without the fearful whisper of months past. Tyler's protective instincts merged beautifully with playful big brother energy as he coached them both. The game that ensued was more about laughter than competition, more about connection than scoring points. When Isaiah missed a shot, Tyler was there with encouragement and tips for improvement. When Lila wanted to try, both brothers cheered her on, celebrating her effort regardless of the outcome. Later, as they all worked together in the kitchen preparing Monique's mac and cheese recipe, the sense of family was palpable. Tyler read the instructions from the worn recipe card, while Isaiah measured ingredients and Lila insisted on stirring the cheese sauce, just like Mom used to. "Mom would love this," Lila said suddenly, watching the four of them move around the kitchen in comfortable synchronization. She always said a kitchen full of love makes the food taste better. She was right, Isaiah agreed, carefully sprinkling the breadcrumbs on top of the casserole. Everything's better with love. Tyler, who had been quietly observing the siblings, spoke up. "Tell me more about her? About your mom?" The question would have brought tears months ago, but now both children smiled, eager to share memories of Monique with their new brother. As they worked, they told stories about her dedication to her patients, her love of gospel music, her ability to make even ordinary days feel special. "She sounds amazing," Tyler said sincerely, helping Lila reach a high shelf. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have loved you," Lila declared with the simple certainty of a child. "You take care of us just like she did." The comment brought tears to Tyler's eyes, and Ethan watched as his oldest son pulled both siblings into a gentle hug. These moments of emotional honesty, of freely expressed love and grief, were precious parts of their healing journey. As they sat down to dinner, the mac and cheese perfectly browned on top just as Monique's recipe promised, Ethan looked around at his expanded family. Tyler, once distant and angry, now fully embraced his role as big brother. Isaiah and Lila, once trapped in a nightmare of separation and abuse, now thriving in an environment of love and support. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and playful teasing. They discussed Isaiah's upcoming basketball tryouts, Lila's improving grades, Tyler's new job, and plans for the weekend. Normal family dinner talk that felt miraculous given where they'd started. After dinner, Tyler kept his promise to help Isaiah practice. The sound of the basketball on the driveway mixed with Lila's cheerleading and Tyler's coaching created a symphony of ordinary joy. Ethan stood in the doorway watching, his heart full. Mrs. Reynolds, who had stayed for dinner, stood beside him. "You've built something beautiful here," she said softly. "Something healing." "They did the hard work," Ethan replied, watching as Tyler taught Isaiah a new dribbling technique. "I just provided the space for it to happen." "That's what good parents do," she smiled. "They create safe spaces for healing and growth." Monique did that for them in their early years, giving them the foundation to survive what came after. You're doing it now, helping them rebuild and thrive. As the evening wound down, the children's energy finally flagging, they gathered in the living room. Isaiah and Lila had started a tradition of ending each day with one of their mother's favorite hymns. Tyler had learned to play some of them on guitar, adding another layer of healing through music. "This little light of mine," they sang together, their voices harmonizing in the quiet room. "I'm gonna let it shine." Ethan watched his children, all three of them, sharing this moment of peace and remembrance. The road ahead would still have challenges. There would be more difficult therapy sessions, more nightmares to soothe, more emotional hurdles to overcome. But they would face it together, as a family. As the song ended, Lila yawned widely, prompting chuckles from her brothers. The evening routine began. Teeth brushing, pajamas, final drinks of water. Tyler hugged his siblings goodnight, promising to return soon for more basketball practice and family dinners. In their rooms, Isaiah and Lila settled into beds that represented safety rather than confinement. Their nightlights cast soft glows that kept the darkness at bay, and their doors remained slightly open, small but significant details in their ongoing recovery. "Good night, Mr. Ethan," they called out in unison, using the name that had evolved, from formal address to term of endearment. Soon Ethan knew they might feel ready to call him Dad. But there was no rush. Like everything in their healing journey, it would happen in its own time. "Good night, my loves," he replied, his heart full of gratitude for these extraordinary children who had taught him so much about resilience, love, and the power of family to heal even the deepest wounds. As he walked downstairs, Ethan paused to straighten a new family photo on the wall. It showed all four of them at a recent park picnic, smiling genuinely at the camera. Next to it hung a picture of Monique with Isaiah and Lila from happier days, ensuring that their mother remained a visible, honored part of their story. The house settled into nighttime quiet, but it was a peaceful silence rather than the heavy quiet of grief or fear. In their rooms above, Isaiah and Lila slept safely, their healing journey continuing even in dreams. And in this home built on love, understanding, and patience, hope continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The federal courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps crowded with reporters and cameras. Ethan held Isaiah and Lila's hands. As they made their way through the crowd, Tyler walking protectively behind them. This was the day they'd been preparing for, the final trial that would bring justice not just for their family, but for all the children who had suffered at the hands of the trafficking ring. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Heather Williams sat at the defense table, her designer clothes replaced by prison orange, her once perfect hair now limp and graying. Judge Bradford occupied the space beside her, his imperious demeanor shattered by months in custody. Behind them sat other defendants, social workers who had falsified documents, corrupt officials who had buried investigations, wealthy clients who had knowingly purchased trafficked children. Isaiah squeezed Ethan's hand as they took their seats in the front row. The boy had insisted on testifying, despite his therapist's concerns about the emotional toll. "Mom would want the truth to come out," he'd said with quiet determination. "All of it." The prosecutor, Rachel Martinez, approached their row. "Are you ready?" she asked Isaiah gently. They'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, ensuring he understood the importance of his testimony while protecting him from unnecessary trauma. Isaiah nodded, his shoulders straight, despite the fear evident in his eyes. Lila reached across Ethan to grab her brother's other hand. "Remember what Mom said about telling the truth," she whispered. "It sets you free." The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered, a different judge, one known for her integrity and commitment to children's rights. The trial began with opening statements, the prosecutor laying out the devastating scope of the trafficking operation. Evidence mounted as witnesses took the stand, former employees of the adoption agency, investigators who had uncovered the money trails, experts who detailed the psychological impact on the victims. When Isaiah's name was called, he stood with quiet dignity. Ethan watched his son walk to the witness stand, seeing both the trauma he'd endured and the strength he'd developed. The boy looked so small behind the wooden barrier, but his voice carried clearly as he was sworn in. "Isaiah," Prosecutor Martinez began gently, "can you tell us about the night you and your sister were taken from your mother?" Isaiah's voice trembled slightly but grew stronger as he spoke. "We were having dinner. Mom had made mac and cheese, her special recipe with the crispy breadcrumbs on top. Lila was doing her homework at the kitchen table. Everything was normal until we heard the noise at the front door." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Isaiah described the terror of that night. The men breaking in, his mother's desperate attempt to protect her children, the way they'd been separated and told they'd never see each other again. He recounted the years of abuse at Heather's hands, the constant threats, the attempts to make him forget his real family. "Mrs. Williams said Mom gave us away," Isaiah continued, his eyes finding Heather's face across the courtroom. "She said Mom didn't want us anymore, but I knew she was lying. My mom loved us more than anything. She died trying to protect us." Heather flinched at these words, her carefully maintained facade cracking. Behind her, several jurors wiped away tears. "Even when they hurt me, I wouldn't forget." Isaiah's voice grew stronger. "I remembered everything Mom taught us, about love being stronger than hate, about the truth always coming out in the end. That's how Officer Brooks found us. Because I remembered. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest Isaiah was confused about the events, that his memories were unreliable. But Isaiah remained steady, his answers clear and consistent. When asked why he'd waited so long to tell anyone the truth, his response silenced the courtroom. Because nobody would listen, he said simply. Nobody except Officer Brooks. He believed me, and now everyone knows the truth. After Isaiah's testimony, more evidence was presented. Financial records showing payments for trafficked children, emails discussing procurement of new victims, the surveillance video showing Monique's final fight to protect her children. The prosecution built an overwhelming case of corruption, greed, and cruelty. Lila held Ethan's hand tightly as they watched Heather take the stand in her own defense. The woman's attempts to justify her actions fell flat in the face of the evidence. Her claims of providing better homes for the children rang hollow when confronted with proof of abuse and neglect. Did you know these children had been taken from their mother by force? The prosecutor asked. We provided opportunities, Heather insisted, her voice brittle. These children came from poverty, from single-parent homes. We gave them advantages their real families never could. Advantages? Rachel's voice dripped with controlled anger. Like locking Isaiah in a basement when he cried for his mother? Like telling Lila her brother was dead? Like covering up Monique Jackson's murder? Heather's composure finally cracked. She wouldn't let go, she burst out. We tried to reason with her, offered her money, but she wouldn't give up her kids. What else were we supposed to do? The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The judge called for order as Heather realized what she'd admitted. Her lawyers looked stricken. Judge Bradford was the last to testify, having agreed to provide evidence against his co-conspirators in exchange for considerations in sentencing. He detailed how the trafficking ring had operated, how they'd identified vulnerable families, falsified documents, and buried investigations. We chose targets carefully, he admitted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Single parents working multiple jobs, especially minorities, people we thought wouldn't have the resources to fight back, people whose disappearances wouldn't attract too much attention. During closing arguments, Rachel Martinez stood before the jury holding the cross necklace that had belonged to Monique, the one Isaiah had managed to keep throughout his captivity. This necklace survived because love survived, she told the jury. Because a mother's love gave her children the strength to hold on to who they really were. Monique Jackson died protecting her children. She deserved justice then. Her children deserve justice now. All these children deserve justice. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdicts were read one after another, guilty on all counts. Heather's face crumpled as she heard her sentence. Multiple life terms. No possibility of parole. Judge Bradford and the other conspirators received similar sentences, their crimes too numerous and severe for leniency. As the courtroom emptied, Isaiah and Lila approached the prosecutor's table. Rachel knelt to their level as Isaiah handed her a small envelope. What's this? She asked softly. Pictures of Mom, Lila explained. We want you to keep them, so you remember why you fought for us. Rachel embraced both children, her professional demeanor breaking for a moment. I will never forget, she promised. None of us will. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Ethan started to guide the children toward their car, but Isaiah paused on the steps. Can I say something? He asked quietly. Like Mom would? Ethan nodded, understanding his son's need to speak his truth. The cameras turned as Isaiah faced them, holding his sister's hand. My mom taught us that love is stronger than anything bad in the world, he said clearly. She was right. Love helped us remember who we are. Love helped us find each other again. And love helped good people like Officer Brooks and Ms. Martinez fight for kids like us. Lila joined in, her voice harmonizing with her brother's. Mom also taught us that telling the truth sets you free. So if there are other kids out there who were taken like we were, don't be afraid to tell your truth. There are people who will listen. There are people who will help. The siblings' words made headlines across the country, inspiring other victims to come forward and spurring investigations into similar trafficking operations. Their story became a catalyst for change: stricter oversight of adoption agencies, better protection for vulnerable families, increased resources for investigating missing children cases. Back home that evening, the family gathered in the living room. Tyler had ordered pizza, a celebration of justice served and a new chapter beginning. Isaiah and Lila sat close together on the couch, emotionally drained but peaceful. "Mom would be proud of you both," Ethan said softly. "So proud." "We know," Isaiah smiled, looking at the family photo wall where Monique's picture held a place of honor. "She is proud. We can feel it." As night fell, the house settled into its familiar rhythm of evening routines. The children got ready for bed, their movements no longer haunted by fear. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and love had shown the way home. In their rooms, Isaiah and Lila said their nightly prayers, a tradition carried from their life with Monique into their new family with Ethan. They sang their mother's favorite hymn softly, its message of light overcoming darkness more meaningful than ever. Ethan listened from the hallway, his heart full of love for these remarkable children who had transformed tragedy into triumph. Their mother's light truly did shine on, burning brightly in the truth they'd fought to reveal and the justice they'd helped achieve. The case had changed laws, saved lives, and brought down a corrupt system. But its greatest victory was visible in the peaceful faces of two children who could finally sleep without fear, secure in their identities and their new family's love. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting rainbow patterns across the congregation. 1 year had passed since the trials that had brought justice to so many families, and the community had gathered to celebrate the opening of the Monique Jackson Memorial Center, a safe haven for recovered trafficking victims and their families. Isaiah and Lila stood at the podium together, their voices strong and clear as they addressed the packed church. They'd grown taller over the past year, their faces fuller and healthier, their eyes bright with purpose rather than shadowed by fear. Ethan watched from the front pew, his heart swelling with pride as his children shared their story of healing and hope. "Our mom always said that helping people who can't help themselves is the most important job in the world," Isaiah began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "She was a nurse who took care of sick children, and she taught us that love is the strongest medicine." Lila picked up the thread seamlessly. "When bad people took us away from her, Mom fought to protect us. She gave her life trying to keep us safe. But her love stayed with us, helping us remember who we really were, helping us find our way back to each other." The Memorial Center had been Ethan's idea, but the children had thrown themselves into its planning with remarkable dedication. The facility would provide counseling, legal aid, and support services to families affected by trafficking. More importantly, it would offer a safe space for children to heal and reconnect with their identities. Tyler sat beside Ethan, beaming at his younger siblings. The past year had transformed them all, knitting them into a true family. The weekly basketball games in their driveway had become a neighborhood event, with other local children joining in. Lila had discovered a talent for art therapy, often helping younger survivors express their feelings through painting and drawing. "This center is dedicated to our mom," Isaiah continued, "but it's also for everyone who helped us find our way home. Officer Brooks, who believed us when nobody else would. Ms. Martinez, who made sure the bad people faced justice. Mrs. Reynolds, who gave us a safe place to start healing. And it's for all the other kids out there who might be scared and lonely, like we were," Lila added. "Mom always said that truth is like the sun. It might hide behind clouds for a while, but it always finds its way out eventually." After the ceremony, people gathered in the new center next door. The walls were painted in warm, welcoming colors, with inspirational quotes stenciled between photographs of survivors and their families. Monique's portrait hung in the entrance hall, her gentle smile watching over all who entered seeking help and healing. Isaiah led tours of the facility, proudly showing off the counseling rooms, art therapy studio, and family meeting spaces. Lila worked with Mrs. Reynolds at the welcome desk, helping other children feel safe and understood from the moment they arrived. Their personal experiences had given them unique insights into what survivors needed most. Ethan stood back, watching. His family worked together to create something beautiful from their pain. The center would help countless others, but it had also given Isaiah and Lila a way to honor their mother's memory through service to others. "You've done something remarkable here," Sarah commented, joining him by the wall of survivor photos. "These kids, they're incredible." "They're their mother's children," Ethan replied softly. "Monique's strength lives on in everything they do." The afternoon sun painted the center's rooms in warm light as families gathered for the first support group meeting. Isaiah and Lila shared their story again, this time with other children who understood exactly what they'd been through. The healing power of shared experience filled the room as more survivors found their voices. That evening back home, the family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner. Tyler had mastered Monique's mac and cheese recipe, and the familiar aroma filled the kitchen with memories. As they sat around the table saying grace just as Monique had taught them, Ethan looked at his children's peaceful faces and felt profound gratitude. "I got an A on my history test," Lila announced as they passed the dishes, "and Ms. Parker says I might be ready for advanced math next year." "The basketball team made it to championships," Isaiah added proudly. "Coach says I might even start in the final game." Tyler grinned at his siblings' achievements. "Maybe we should celebrate with ice cream after dinner. That little shop near the park." The mention of ice cream no longer triggered painful memories for Lila. Instead, she smiled, remembering how they'd stopped there after the trial, creating new, joyful associations to replace the old trauma. Later, as the children got ready for bed, Ethan hung a new family photo on the wall, this one taken at the center's opening ceremony. Isaiah and Lila stood tall and proud, flanked by Ethan and Tyler, with Monique's portrait visible in the background. It was a perfect representation of their rebuilt family, honoring the past while embracing their future together. "Good night." "Dad," Isaiah called from the top of the stairs, the word still new enough to make Ethan's heart skip a beat. Lila echoed her brother, adding a quick, "Love you," before disappearing into her room. Ethan turned off the lights downstairs, pausing to straighten Monique's photo on the wall. "They're okay," he whispered to her image. "They're more than okay. They're amazing, just like their mother." The house settled into peaceful quiet, no longer haunted by fear or loss. Outside, stars twinkled in the clear night sky, reminding Ethan of another saying Monique had taught her children. "Love is like the stars. Even in the darkest night, it shows us the way home." In their rooms above, Isaiah and Lila slept safely, their dreams no longer plagued by shadows. And in this home built on love, truth, and healing, hope continued to light the way forward for all of them. If this story touched your heart, hit like and subscribe for more tales of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Remember, in a world where truth often hides behind money and power, sometimes all it takes is one voice to bring light to the darkness. Like, subscribe, and share this story, because somewhere another child might need to hear that they're not alone.